Okay, well, welcome to the Southeast Conference on Israel-Palestine 2014. First, we're going to have a welcome and prayer from David Bartlett of Trinity Presbyterian Church. And we'd like to go ahead and thank Trinity Presbyterian Church for hosting this conference and annually for their support over the years for the numerous conferences we've had in the past. After David Bartlett gives his prayer and welcome, Mary Smar, who's the chair of the sponsoring organization Joining Hands for Justice in Israel and Palestine, will give a brief introduction to that organization. So, the floor is yours.
Thank you. We're delighted that you're here on behalf of Trinity Church. This is an important part of our ministry, and we're delighted that you can be present to us and help us understand our role in these important issues. Will you join me in prayer? Holy God, make us instruments of your peace. Where we need justice, let us seek for justice. Where we need reconciliation, let us work toward reconciliation. Surround us by your mercy and help us to serve your will. Amen.
Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning.
Welcome. It's exciting to see so many of you here today. We're delighted that you're here. As Chris has said, I'm chair of Joining Hands for Justice in Israel and Palestine. We are a partnership of the Presbyterian of Greater Atlanta, and we have been in existence for a number of years, since about 2000. And we are made up of primarily representatives from the various churches in the Atlanta Presbyterian. But we welcome others to come and join us. So you're welcome if you want to come and join us. We meet on third Thursdays at North Decatur Presbyterian Church. So we invite you to join with us. Our mission is to promote peace with justice in Israel and Palestine and bring an end to the occupation. And we do that primarily through prayer, through advocacy, and through education. And this is one of our educational opportunities here today. And that's why we're so delighted to see you. Today, it brings the end of the World Week for Peace for 2014. And this is an annual event, happens every year. And this year the theme is Let My People Go. So this is an event, the Palestinian Israel Ecumenical Forum of the World Council of Churches is responsible for inviting churches and other organizations to become a part of this. So we have taken this on because their emphasis is similar to, or the same pretty much, as the emphasis of Joining Hands for Justice. So we have taken on to participate in several activities. Today is the end of the week. It started last Sunday. It's September the 21st through the 27th. And so during that time, they also advocate for peace and an end to the occupation. Today, one of our speakers will be talking about political prisoners, and that relates to the theme of Let My People Go. So I invite you, that's a part of what they have been emphasizing over the last week, is the political prison system there in Israel and Palestine. I am delighted to have you here. I also want to recognize Chris. You met Chris Weaver, who is the chair for our committee this year. And the other members of that committee I want to recognize, even though I think a lot of them are outside. I don't know if any of them are inside. We met them at registration and at the tables outside. But I'd like to ask us to give them a hand. I believe that we have an excellent conference planned for you, and we want to give yourselves a hand for being here. We thank you very much for coming. So let's give you a hand.
All right, well, the first half of the program today, we have Dr. Ilise Cohen. She's going to discuss liberation and justice in Palestine and Israel. And then after that, we have Azda Shashahani, and she's going to discuss political prisoners. She was on a delegation to the West Bank a couple months ago as part of her work with the National Lawyers Guild. So that should be, both of those should be really interesting. And then after that, we have Allah Obiad, who's going to talk about the environmental effects of the occupation, water supply, and treatment. So and then after that, we're going to have question and discussion. Sam Jones in the back has been distributing cards with pens. So if you didn't get a note card or you need a pen, see him near that window back there.
I'm right here.
Oh, there he is.
I'm missing a lot of pens.
Okay, there's a lot of pens back there. So, so once we get to the question and answer period, just hold your questions, write them on the piece of paper, and then just I'll ask for you guys to pass them forward, and we'll go from there. So, with no further ado, I'd like to introduce Ilise Cohen.
So before I get started, I just want to say I'm absolutely intimidated to talk this morning. One reason is because we're talking about Israel and Palestine, and every other speaker in the large group is a Palestinian speaker. And so for me, I feel like as a Jewish person coming up here, I feel really terrified. I also feel like I was up until 2:30 in the morning. It was Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, and I was like, how do I make this New Year really, really big? And I have 55 slides to show you in like 25 minutes. I will probably be on the first 2 slides and get stuck in details, and so what I need from you is for you to tell me if there is information that you want from me that, that would be helpful. And also if there's any clarifying questions or comments or things that you want to say along the way. I started off because I wanted to share a little bit about my story, which can get long-winded, so I want to try and do it quickly. And then talk a little bit about what the occupation is. But before I do that, I want to know how many people here feel like they know the details of the occupation? Raise your hands higher. How many of you feel like hearing some of the details of the occupation and seeing images would be helpful? Okay, great. So those of you that know the details, guess what? You get to participate along the way and help with creating this. So now that I said I'm terrified, I feel so much better. So one of the, and I told everybody that I met along the way that I was terrified. Liberation and justice. So one of the things that I wanted to say about being a Jewish person doing this work and why I have 50 slides and still felt like it wasn't enough. And then felt like Gaza was in the wrong place and I needed to shift something and there wasn't an image of this and how I was going to get this voice, is because as a Jewish person doing this work, I feel like there aren't enough Jews and there's not enough people in my community who are saying it loudly and saying it with specifics and making the relationships with Palestinians to make a difference. But I am very, very grateful. And you have to be excited about all the Jews that are doing amazing work. Especially the Jewish Voice for Peace, of which I'm a part, and that those are voices that I really want to hold, and that we have to keep pushing our community, and we have to keep making alliances, and we want you to be behind us in terms of making sure that you're combating anti-Semitism, while you're also speaking loudly and boldly about ending occupation. So however you do that, that's the one message that I want you to get from here. Very long-winded, quick story. Is I grew up going to Jewish day school here in Atlanta, and my grandfather was a rabbi, and my family's originally from Turkey, and I rose in Cuba. And some of you may have heard some of this story before. And when I was in high school, I begged my mom, we did not have the resources for this, but I begged her and I said, I really want to go on this program called High School in Israel. And so we figured it out. I figured out how to make the money work. It was my senior year. And when I was there, I was learning about 4,000 years of Jewish civilization. I arrived, I got on the tarmac in Israel, in Tel Aviv, I kissed the ground and I was bawling. And I really felt like I came home. Like I had never thought that a Jewish person could feel at home. Because as a minority, you're constantly navigating, and many of you know this who are in minority spaces, or if you're women, or other ways that you might identify, constantly negotiating what it is to feel different, or to feel like you have to deal with a dominant space. While I was there, one of the things that also happened was that the first Intifada began. And in that first Intifada, all I kept hearing is things about Arabs this, Arabs that, there was violence, I didn't understand what was going on, and I went to my teachers, who were all Jewish and Israeli, and I said, can you please tell me what's going on? I have a lot of questions, what's happening, who are the Arabs? And they would not answer me. And that was the first time ever in my Jewish community that when I raised a question, nobody would discuss it. And so it terrified me. I didn't understand it. So that was one glimpse of, okay, I left with what is happening, I don't understand. It shook me a little bit, but I wasn't really clear. So my junior year abroad at Washington University, I decided that I was going to study U.S. intervention in Latin America. I did not want to be ethnocentric. I wanted to focus on how the U.S. has done horrible things around the world. and also what to do to repair that as a U.S. citizen, because we all want to make our state or our country better, right? Yes. Okay. Is there anybody that would say no? Don't show me. Okay, anyway, so that's why you're all here. So as I prepared to go to Colombia, South America, because I thought that would be a great place for me to go, my university said, it's way too dangerous, we're not sending the program there. And so I was like, well, what am I going to do? I want to go away for my junior year abroad. I don't want to go to an English-speaking country. I'm sorry for all of you that have been to English-speaking countries for a junior year abroad. I'm sure it was fantastic. For me, I really wanted to be somewhere else and practice the language. And when I arrived, so I said, well, I guess I'll just go to Israel, because I had some background in Hebrew. I would be able to learn more. Well, 2 days later, after arriving in Israel, Iraq invaded Kuwait. And one of the first things Iraq said is that if the U.S. intervenes, then it will start sending rockets or chemical weapons to Israel. So as you can imagine, my mom was freaking out. And for those of us that were there, we had to learn how to use gas masks, seal a room. And during that time, I also remember, and we even had to learn, there was some kind of shot that if you felt like you were exposed to chemical weapons, you would inject yourself, and then I remember something about you put this little thing on your shoulder and you wait for an ambulance. I don't even know what I'm remembering about it, but that's my message. It was very terrifying, but I also felt like, okay, I am one with people. But it was also still during the first Intifada. And I had an amazing professor named Daphne Golan, who's an international human rights lawyer in Israel. And I was taking a class with her called Human Rights and International Law. And that was the first time, as a U.S. citizen, I was exposed to human rights and international law. I never learned it in the United States, right? This is in the early 90s. And one of the things that or in 1990, and one of the things I remember her saying is her example in order to understand international rights and international law and human rights was about the occupation. And so all of a sudden it started to make sense why my community was silent on my first trip. It started to make sense why we weren't talking about it, because there was shame associated with it, because it was really horrible what was happening, because there was a mechanism of control where when the Fourth Geneva Convention was established after World War II in order to make sure that other people were not occupied brutally, or people were not killed brutally, like Jewish people and like members of my family, that all of a sudden that was being violated with Palestinians and with them being under occupation under Israeli law. So I got a huge glimpse and was really, really moved by this and very confused, but also felt like, now this feels connected to my Jewish identity. And why? Because everything I learned was about justice and about questioning and about tikkun olam, repairing the world. And so when I think about liberation and justice, I think liberation is also liberating the oppressor, right? It's liberating us who were oppressed, and how do we get that off? How do we get that feeling of victimization off at the same time as it is liberating us as oppressors? And that we actually need the people who are oppressed to help us with that. So I feel like many of the alliances that Jews are making, whether they're Israeli Jews or whether they're Jews around the world, American Jews, is that those connections and solidarity with Palestinians and with people who are working on this is actually helping all of us heal and moving towards some kind of justice. So that sounded very narcissistic for me to talk about my liberation in terms of Palestinians helping me, but I hope you understood it in the context of Paulo Freire. How many of you know about him? Pedagogy of the Oppressed? Great. Those of you that don't know him, you need to read him. And I'm going to read one thing from him. I didn't mean that in a mean way. I just meant I would urge you, strongly urge you, thinking about reading them. There are many people I would suggest. So one of the things he says is the oppressor is solidary with the oppressed only when he stops regarding the oppressed as an abstract category and sees them as persons who have been unjustly dealt with, deprived of their voice, cheated in their sale of their labor, when he stops making pious, sentimental, and individualistic gestures and risks an act of love. True solidarity is found only in the plenitude of this act of love, in its existentiality and in its praxis. To affirm that men and women, or every person, as persons should be free, and yet to do nothing tangible, is to make this affirmation a reality. To make this affirmation a reality is a farce. So for me, I hold that as a central part. Now, one of the things that happens in the Jewish community, I bet you I'm never going to get to this. I bet that's what's going to happen. How are y'all doing? Is this helpful? Should I show you the maps? I'm going to get there. Okay. How much more time do I have? Enough. Don't.
We're making this a reality. How are we going to
Yeah, making this a reality. So somehow we're going to make this a reality. So the other piece of my story that I wanted to share is that I left before the Gulf War started. And I returned to the States, and when I graduated from college, the one thing that I felt like I needed to do was buy a one-way ticket to Israel. I didn't know what I was going to be doing, but I also felt like I need to be a part of a solution and not part of the problem, just supporting Israel. And so I lived a year in a Palestinian Israeli city, a year in Jewish areas, and at the time there was a lot of support for democracy and action projects. I mean, I could probably really break this down today. At the time, it was lots of money going toward projects to bring Palestinians and Jews inside Israel together. Now, I thought that was a fantastic thing because most Palestinians and Jews were not meeting each other in Israel. Now we can say that's happening in Israel, and it also has been happening between the occupied territories and Israel. There's a wall, you can't see the wall. Israelis, for the most part, can check out and notice that nothing's going on. But part of the realities of being a Jewish person working on this and being part of the Jewish community, I am an educator in my synagogue, I participate in a whole array of connections with my community, is that you get targeted for basically supporting or for allowing other people to support anti-Semitism and the destruction of the Jews or destruction of Israel. And so I would like to say for anybody who is worried about that, whether they're Jews in the room or Presbyterians or other folks who've been working on this, Palestinians, is that I'm very clear that, that we have to work on parallel tracks. And one is we have to work, especially in this country, against anti-Arab racism, Islamophobia, and anti-Semitism. And if we hold those together without getting them linked, then we've created some of that liberation. Because we're saying the people who have oppressed us and how the oppression continues cyclically, we are agreeing not to let that continue. And that means you have to speak boldly all the time. I don't know how many of you hear anti-Arab remarks or Islamophobic remarks, but I hear them all the time, and it's not in the Jewish community. I'm sure it is there also, but it's everywhere. And when I hear or I see that somebody's saying something like, you know, the Zionists this, the Jews this, to me, it completely collapses and erases multiple histories. So we have to break it down, and I'll give you one example. Rabbis for Human Rights, Rabbi Ara Kasherman, is an incredible activist, and he has basically dedicated his life after moving to Israel to, I realize that might be a contradiction, move to Israel, make Aliyah, become a citizen, but at the same time make this commitment. But go with me here. So he's made a commitment to stand up for Palestinian rights, for Bedouin rights, to be able to go when homes are being demolished and make sure that he is there. He's gotten arrested multiple times. It's illegal for Israelis to go into most parts of the West Bank, even to meet with Palestinians or work in solidarity. He's helped replant olive trees that have been uprooted. He has gone to court, legal courts. He raises money to make sure that he's there at all important times. And during the Gaza assaults, he was actually out in the streets calling for rabbis to protect Palestinian citizens of Israel because of what was happening inside Israel. So he is one of those people that has said, I'm a Zionist. But the way he has decided to use Zionism is to say Zionism is about liberating all people. And he doesn't have a solution anymore. I see a eyes in the back, but I can't understand what that means. But I want to say that that's why you can't say one word and that it means something. If you say all Jews, or you say all Jews from the Middle East, then you're also including me. And if most Jews from the Middle East and Israel are more right-wing, then you're not including my voice and the voices of people who know that having been in the Middle East was much more safe than being in Europe. So we need to learn all these pieces of history while we also simultaneously work on ending the occupation and the siege of Gaza. Okay, is that enough about me? Is that a yes? Is that nervous laughter? All right, great. Do y'all want to see this? How much more time do I really have? 20? Oh my gosh, okay. I thought I had 25 to get. All right, so this map, the UN partition plan. The UN partition plan which separates the Arab and the Jewish state. Okay, what's problematic about that? One thing that's problematic about a Jewish and Arab state. A Jewish state and an Arab state. Anybody can. What was that?
doesn't work.
It doesn't work.
It's all chocolate.
It's not real Swiss cheese.
Jewish is a religion versus Arab is not a nationality. We are mixing apples and oranges.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so even if we said, what about the Jews from the Arab world who may at the time have identified themselves as Arab Jews? Does this work? Makes it pretty complicated, doesn't it? Okay, what about the Palestinians who are living in the Jewish areas and now you're under a Jewish state? Does that work?
No.
Okay, so, but when you think about the concept of Zionism as was created in the late 1800s, so we'll talk about that kind of Zionism, 1800s, and again, there were multiple forms. Is it a part of Zionism feeling like there should be a national home for Jews in order to liberate Jews from anti-Semitism and European anti-Semitism? How many of you have studied the 2,000 years of Christian anti-Semitism? So I want y'all to look at this again. Raise your hands if you have studied 2,000 years of Christian anti-Semitism. Raise your hands high. Look around. So should I feel safe as a Jew if I'm talking about liberation of Jews for a national home, and most people in this room have never learned about what Christian anti-Semitism was? Do you see what I mean? And it's not at all to take away from the commitment to ending the oppression on Palestinians. Not at all. It's to say, how do you do both? How do you make a commitment to both? And that is my security. That's why I do this work. It's because I know you're going to be behind me, and you're going to be behind Palestinian liberation. You are not going to chuck me out at the end. And if you do, I'm going to be really, really mad. I'm going to talk really fast, and then you're not going to want to hear what I have to say. Okay. So, but seriously, without the joking part, I hope you get my message about what that means. And as someone who made a commitment to go to the Presbyterian USA General Assembly in order to be on a Jewish Voice for Peace team to support divestment from 3 U.S. companies, and the kinds of battles that were happening with that, theoretical battles, the emotional battles, the Jewish communities who were sending letters to say, whatever you do, don't support this, and Jewish Voice for Peace members who were saying, whatever you do, support your conscience, we completely support you, we know you're not anti-Semitic, is how do we know? How do I know? Faith? Good faith? Okay. All right, so the UN partition plan. The Jewish leadership said yes. It was the European Jewish leadership. The Sephardic Jewish leadership, Sephardic Jews are Jews who were kicked out of Spain, and they were in the area. Many of them actually said they didn't want a state. And part of that is because they were already living in an empire where they were citizens. They were already able to move from one place to another, and they were treated equally, or treated as equal as you could be under the Ottoman Empire, being different than how European Jews understood being a majority or having a state. And this is also in terms of nationalism. How do you talk about nationalism? When we talk about the United States, do you only think in terms of pride, or do you think in terms of critique? Should I ask you that question? How many of you think in terms of critique? Fantastic. Those of you who don't, it's an opportunity to think about it. Okay. So, and the Arab states said, no, we're not going to take this. And that makes sense, because it doesn't actually work for everybody. It splits it in a bizarre way, and it gives agricultural land to certain people, Jerusalem is in the middle, and then the majority of the land was going to end up, 56% of the land was going to go to a Jewish state, even though 7% of the land was actually owned by Jews, only 7%, and the other 40-something% was going to go to Palestinians. I can't figure out how to work this. Just a minute. This thing. There we go. Okay. So 1948, 1949, what happened? 78% of the land ended up under the new Israeli state. So that included ethnic cleansing of over 700,000 Palestinians who went to different places all over the Middle East, including Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Egypt, Gaza. And then you also had Palestinians that were internal refugees inside the state that are not even recognized up until today. So they could be a kilometer away from their villages and their cities, and they still have not been allowed to return to their original lands, even though they're citizens of the state. There were also over 450, I know there's many, many statistics, I'm going for the lowest possible version in case anybody here is going to try to object to it, but people say anywhere between 450 and 600 villages were razed, so let's go for the 450. But just think of one village absolutely erased. How many of you live in little areas or pockets of Atlanta, like Virginia Highlands? or Candler Park, or Druid Hills. Okay, so imagine those areas completely wiped out, having to move and not having a way to come back. Then the other thing about this is, in 1967, with the war and the occupation, is that Israel acquired the territories, or took the territories of the West Bank, which had been under Jordanian control, the Gaza Strip and Sinai, which was under Egyptian control, and the Golan Heights under Syrian control, and then East Jerusalem. And so in taking that territory, one of the things that the Israeli government did is not say, okay, well, we take the territory and we also take the people in war. They said, how can we keep as much property as possible without keeping the people? And so this has been the ongoing problem, right? And part of that is, I don't know how many of you know that in Jerusalem, the municipal website in Jerusalem actually states that it only allows 70% of the population has to be Jewish and 30% can be Palestinian. The municipal website. It is clear that if there are over 30% Palestinians, there is some kind of force that's going to be used to make sure Palestinians lose their Palestinian identity of Jerusalem, residency identities, or that there's going to be some kind of wall. An example of this is Walajeh, which is a small village right outside, or that was considered part of Jerusalem, is now separated out by a wall, and they do not have the same residency rights that they had before. Or an example of Abu Dis, where you have a wall right in the middle of East Jerusalem separating out a community from itself. It has nothing to do with security in that case. It has everything to do with making sure that it's keeping a certain amount of population of Jews inside Israel, or inside what Israel considers to be Israel. Plus, the municipal borders were expanded, and so what Israel considers Jerusalem, if you ask an Israeli and you say, what does Ma'ale Adumim, they'll say it's a neighborhood of Jerusalem. Givat Ze'ev, all these other settlements. But if you ask somebody who actually knows where the Green Line is, or you know where the initial borders of East Jerusalem were, they know that it's part of the West Bank that's been confiscated, now called Jerusalem. That's why in 2000, with the Barack Obama Arafat offer, the generous offer, some of you remember that, is that if you were given, this is the question I like to ask, if you were given 95% of the West, if you were Palestinian, given 95% of the occupied territories, and said, okay, you can have a state, would you take it? Palestinians don't answer the question. 95%, you were given 95%, would you take it in a negotiation?
I think yes, until you know about Jerusalem.
Yes, you're not supposed to say that, but yes. Okay, so not just Jerusalem, right. The areas confiscated for Jerusalem, or the separation of the West Bank into three, or the confiscation where the settlements are, that they're actually on water aquifers in the West Bank. So all of this are things where the 95% would have been absolutely unacceptable. And that most Americans don't understand or have the knowledge or go into the details of what this actually means.
In 2000, it wasn't Barack Obama, it was Bill Clinton in the era.
Sorry,
That's
yeah.
all right, just to make sure.
Did I say Barack? Did I say Barack? I meant Barack, Ehud Barak. Yes, did I say Barack twice? I said Obama instead of Clinton. Sorry, I'm getting lots of things confused. All right, one mistake.
There we go.
Okay. Okay. So here, so this was part of what the Oslo Accords were, the peace process, right? So how does this look now when you look at the partition plan and then you look at this? This is the West Bank. The dark areas are the areas where Palestinians were allowed to have full autonomy. Jenin, Tulkarm, Qalqilia, Ramallah, Bethlehem, Hebron, sort of, Jericho. So all these places where Palestinians could have full security and full civil control. And then all the areas around it were areas that would be under Israeli military control and Palestinian civil control. And then all that other white space with the little blue dots everywhere, guess what that was? All Israeli control. So this is what it looks like, but it shrinks over time, right? So does this look like a peace accord? Does this look a way to establish a state or a Palestinian home? You're laughing. Do you want to add anything? It looks like a joke, yes. And what's also interesting is if you ask Jewish people to describe to you, not Jewish people like me, but if you ask Jewish people from the mainstream Jewish community to actually give you a map and explain what's going on, they can't. And part of it is because they have no exposure to it. There are multiple missions every year going with the Jewish Federation, United Jewish Appeal. How many of you have ever been on those delegations? Great. So that you know that you're not actually going at all into the West Bank or into Gaza. You may be meeting with Palestinians inside Israel as citizens, but barely. And if you're going into the West Bank, you wouldn't even know you were, or you'd be meeting with a settler because that's what you're supposed to do. So this does not work out. And I'm just going to show a few other maps of what this looks like. And I can't figure out where to do this. Okay. So part of that map, let me go back for 1 second. Part of that map is what happens with the confiscation of Palestinian territory. And in the confiscation of Palestinian territory, one of the ways that is done is through the demolition of Palestinian homes. And so you have Israeli soldiers who literally take Palestinian families out of their homes within a few minutes, or say you have a few minutes. And we saw this tragically happen in Gaza where, it was so humane that the Israeli government actually sent text messages or phone messages to massive amounts of families to say, get out in 3 minutes, or however long it was, where your entire life, and remember, this is a cash economy. Palestinians put everything in their homes. This is like how you build on top of your home so your family can live there, and that is how you live. Everything goes into that. So when you destroy a Palestinian home, you're destroying multiple aspects of security, or a sense of belonging, or a sense of hope, multiple things. And the amount of resistance that goes into rebuilding after that is incredible. For every Palestinian family that's able to survive that, we should be praising them. And many people will say, well, it's because they were, families associated with suicide bombers. And at some point, yes, collective punishment was to destroy the Palestinian homes of families who were connected to suicide bombers. But it's also people who built a house because they couldn't get a permit. So for 30-something years, or 40-something years, they tried to get a permit to build a house on the land that they live on and that they own, and they were not able to get a permit. So what do you do? How do you stay in your home? You build anyway, because it is your right. And here's an example of a home demolition. And you're talking about big buildings, small buildings, and what that goes into, and what kind of humiliation that is, and what it's like for a Palestinian family to be able to tell a child, why is my home gone today? What do you tell them that will create some kind of humanity to make sure that they also don't hate the people who've done this to them? And it's amazing how many times I can go to Palestine, meeting Palestinians whose homes have been demolished, and they do not look at me like the enemy. I don't know how you recover from that. And here's an example of ICAD, Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions, which many of you may know about, and the rebuilding of homes. It's an Israeli organization that works with Palestinians, Israelis, and internationals to rebuild homes. So here's an example of, so when you think of security and checkpoints and security for Israel and the wall, what do you think is going on for an Israeli for security? What do you think the need is for security? Anybody can answer. I need participation. Okay, suicide bombings, so trying to prevent suicide bombings. What else? Rock throwing. I actually have a story. I want to say one story about rock throwing because I always thought that it was pebbles, and that's usually what it's been. But when I was at Hebrew University, one of the things that happened is that friends of mine were in a car in East Jerusalem, and it was at the time when people would be going on an Israeli bus through the West Bank, the driver would say, duck! And we'd be in the West Bank, and literally the whole bus would duck, and the driver would go as fast as they could. I mean, obviously we knew something was going wrong for us to have to do that on a public bus. But the other thing is one of these cars were hit by a boulder, and her face was disfigured. It was temporary. But it was one of those moments where, as Jewish folks, we couldn't figure out, where do we sit on this? This really feels dangerous. But the idea of stones against a military, the idea of stones against the kind of brutality is overwhelming. So I don't know why I shared that story. I probably should have kept it quiet. Anyway, I want to say about security. So many Palestinians have said, you want a wall? Then have the wall on the 67 lines, right? Have it on the border where we have the last 22% of Palestine and we can have our own home. Well, what Israel was doing was creating, in between all those pockets that we saw earlier of the map, were all these different kinds of checkpoints inside, so from one place to another. And it could be just a barrier in between making sure that a Palestinian community couldn't leave its own community by car. And And so here's an example of one of the checkpoints or terminals. More permanently done is this one. And you can imagine, I'll tell a story of meeting an interfaith peacekeepers delegation, and there was a woman who was there with 3 other family members. She had a piece of paper that said she had a permit to get through to her father's funeral in East Jerusalem, but she had to get through by 7 p.m. It was like 6:53. So I was like, go ahead. And she went ahead, and we all knew that it could take however long for them to get through, even though they were the next ones to go, that if the last one wasn't through by 7 p.m., that it was likely that they could be turned back and not go to the funeral. So that's in the everyday realities, the everyday conditions that people have to go through. And that these are the pieces of occupation that we don't hear about on a day-to-day basis. And look at this. This is at the wall, okay? Not on the 67 borders, with the towers surveilling you, and all the security systems, and having to still. Can you imagine that this is how you go from one place to another every single day? This is not everywhere in Palestine, but the fact that it's anywhere is horrendous. The fact that it's anywhere. Have any of you ever been stuck in these kind of cattle, I don't even know what to call them. Okay. Yes. And so for the hours that you might have to stay there, for the kinds of humiliation that even when you get there, for the waiting, for all of it is treating people like animals. Not that animals should be treated this way for all the animal rights people, but it is treating people like animals. And I'm not trying to make light, but also saying many Americans will have a much more sympathy for how animals are treated than how Palestinians or human beings are treated. Mahsom Watch, thank you Beth for this. Mahsom Watch is an organization of women, Israeli women, who have stood for years, who have stood at the checkpoints and terminals to basically watch the Israeli soldiers. They have cameras, they're writing things down, they have phones, and basically trying to prevent the Israeli soldiers from doing human rights abuses. Now, there can't be enough Israeli women doing this at every checkpoint, every terminal. It's also illegal for some of them to be there. So they're taking a lot of risk in doing this. And I'm going back to think of all the things about the thing that I said earlier in the pedagogy of the oppressed about what did I say? Risking an act of love, right? That you're like risking it on multiple levels. You're risking isolation in your community. You're risking arrest. You're risking a whole bunch of things of, I don't know, while you're also trying to make sure that Palestinians feel at least a little protected in a system that's unjust. So these are the settlement blocks. So before we saw the little dots that were Israeli settlements, and this shows you really how the West Bank is divided. And one of the things about this is that the water aquifers are, for instance, here near the Ariel area and in different places in the West Bank. And you also see how the Jordan Valley is built up. So how do you have a state if you have no borders? If you have no border with any other country and you're controlled militarily around you, is that a state? Good answer.
So the settlement blocks are orange. I think that should be made clear.
Yes, the settlement blocks are the orange part. So as you can see, and that means that's the zoning, not just where the settlements are, but the. This is not working anymore. Okay. Yes.
And the brown is the Palestinians.
These are the Palestinian areas. Yep. And then this is with the civil control under Palestinians, but Israeli military control. And all of this orange and in between white is still under Israeli security, and the settlement blocks are orange. Thank you. Okay. All right. So the Fort Geneva Convention, in case you don't know, how many of you have read human rights documents? Great. How many of you have never looked at them? Great. How many of you have sort of glanced at a couple of things? Fantastic. This is not to embarrass anybody or shame you. It's to say our country specifically makes sure that we do not look at international human rights and international law. It makes sure. I teach in an elite school in Massachusetts, and out of 64 students I had this summer, I asked who has read any human rights documents. There were 2. How does that happen? How does that happen? Okay, anyway, Fort Geneva Convention. I can tell you how it happened, but I don't have time. Okay, the occupying power shall not deport or transfer part of its own civilian population into the territory it occupies. Article 53, any destruction by the occupying power of real or personal property belonging individually or collectively to private persons, or to the state, or to other public authorities, or to social or cooperative organizations is prohibited, except where such destruction is rendered absolutely necessary by military operations. Does that give you some information? Right? Who deems what is necessary for a military operation? Who deems if a house is okay to be knocked down because it's near a road, etc. This is an example of a settlement. So many of you may have known the history of this one, Karkoma or Jabal al-Buqanim in Arabic. So in March 1997, you saw this green hill, which was right in the Jerusalem area between Jerusalem and Bethlehem. And by January 2003, you see its development, and then here's the next development. And it's base supporters on the bottom looking at Karkoma. So this is one example of a settlement, one, and there are hundreds of them. And the settlement population grew to over 500,000 during the peace accords. So that means Israeli citizens were brought or found a way to settle themselves in Palestinian territories. So if we talk about liberation and justice, we also have to talk about what the Saudi Peace Initiative and the other Arab peace initiatives were brought forth, even during the Salt this summer, were brought forth to say, would Israel consider giving the 1967 borders to the Palestinians in order for them to establish a state of their own and deal with the Palestinian refugee problem by allowing refugees the right of return in order to have normalization with the Arab and Muslim countries around it? What do you think of that? Israel has not, the Israeli government has not, and I'll say that the Jewish, American Jews do not talk about this at all either, at least in the mainstream Jewish community, is what do you do with a proposal like that that has happened multiple times since 2002? Where you have the Arab communities of the world say, we will acknowledge, we've already acknowledged your existence, and I need to say something about the existence thing. We've already acknowledged it. You can have peace and normalization with all of us if you just agree. So what the United States' role in this is then taking it and saying, well, if you convince that Israel's only ally is the United States, and the United States doesn't support the movement of being in a peace agreement with the Arab world, because what would that do? That would change our military strategies, that would change our strategic interests. It would create a dynamic Middle East, which might be scary to the United States. I don't know. We could talk about all of it. But the point is that Israel's only ally in the world is the United States. As a Jewish person who knows that the majority of Israelis are Jews, I get really scared about that. Because I know at some point the United States is going to be like, this is not worth it for us. And then what happens to the state of Israel then? Or what happens to the Jewish people in Israel?
Very
So,
well armed.
What was that?
The Israelis are one of the best armed countries in the world.
Yes, which is supported by the U.S.
It'll have
Yes.
to fend
Yes,
for
but
itself.
but it's not about the defending. So let me try and reframe that, because if you got it as a thing about defense, it's not about how do you defend. It's that you're actually creating a condition where Jews already feel unsafe, right? Already, Jews feel an existential threat. Israeli Jews are convinced over and over and over again they're under existential threat. It doesn't mean it's true. But if you have an entire world and the Israeli government or the Israeli state that is majority Jewish at the moment is isolated by itself, then how do you imagine that Jewish people around the world might feel? Do y'all understand? Can you understand that? And I know I'm asking you to look at this while I'm talking about Palestinian liberation. So I don't want to spend too much time on it, but I also want to say it's significant to shift how oppression functions, right? How the oppressors function and what happens with the oppressed in this situation. And the United States' role and why as U.S. citizens we need to be critical is because the U.S. role is tied to this. Okay. Youth Against Settlements in Hebron. So I want to say one thing about Hebron is I feel like Hebron is the microcosm of what's happening in Palestine. I mean, we could also look at Gaza, But Hebron is where you have settlers in the heart of Palestinian territory. Right? So you have between 150 and 200,000 Palestinians, and then 1,000 Israeli settlers in the center. And you have tons of Israeli military supporting those settlers. And the settlers in Hebron tend to be the most violent. And so what you have is even the Hebronite Jews, I don't know if you'll know the story, but the Jews who are originally from Hebron, and there was a massacre in 1929 where some Jews were killed, and that the Jewish families that survived, some of them survived because their Palestinian neighbors kept them safe. And then the Jews that left from Hebron ended up coming back somewhere in the 1990s and during the Oslo Accords. And as the settlements got bigger inside Hebron and more volatile, is they went to the mayor of Hebron and to activists in Hebron, and they said, we as Jews who actually own the land in Hebron want to live in peace with you. We don't agree with settlers coming outside and saying that this is their land. And so why is that important to know? Because the original Jewish landowners of that area came back to say, we understand that this is not okay for Israeli citizens to come in and say this is our land. Like, this is actually our land, and we are okay with you living here. I mean, and all of it is problematic. We could break down every piece of what I just said, but the notion that we don't have that information to help us support moving forward. And Youth Against Settlements is lots of Palestinians who are working on against the settlements, and they're doing more and more surveillance and monitoring, and you should get on their listserv because they will tell you what's happening on a day-to-day basis. And I realize I'm almost out of time, so I'm just going to go through a couple things really quickly. Uprooting Palestinian olive trees, Rabbis for Human Rights, the replanting of olive trees, the bypass roads that the U.S. supports. And these bypass roads go from Israel proper through the West Bank all the way to the Jordan Valley. And those are roads that are Israel-only roads. People say Jewish-only. There are Palestinian Israelis that can go on them also, but they're Israel-only roads. Palestinians from the occupied territories, unless they're from East Jerusalem, cannot go on these roads. And so they're dividing the West Bank even more. For instance, taking away, uprooting olive trees by a bypass road, there's nothing else around. Is that a measure of security? Dahar's Vineyard, some of you may have heard about the Tent of Nations. And the Tent of Nations, here's an example of one of the roadblocks that's by boulders. And if Palestinians take the boulders away from their villages or from their communities, then they can be arrested or detained. Do you know what detained means? Someone who's talking about political prisoners will be able to talk about it. But when you're detained, you get no legal rights. And you can be detained for a long period of time, then let out, then detained again. And this is a problem. So you start to internalize that this is how the occupation has to work, and you start to move around it. And here's an example of Anarchists Against the Wall from Israel, helping Palestinians remove a roadblock. So there's these kinds of things that are happening all the time. And one thing about the wall, international law, International Court of Justice. The court finds construction of a wall by Israel on the occupied Palestinian territory and its associated regime are contrary to international law. It states the legal consequences arising from that illegality. And so you can see the wall weaving, not on the 1967 borders, going inside Palestinian territory, taking Palestinian farmland, demolishing Palestinian homes along the way, being in between Abu Dis, the side of East Jerusalem that's now inside Jerusalem, and the side of Abu Dis that's on the other side of the wall. And you have lots of demonstrations from the popular committees, including in Deen, for instance. 3 years, 5 years, I think it's going on 9 years now. By the way, that's my kid. And you can see the level of the gates. Like, this is one gate along the wall where the Israeli government, the Israeli military has control to open it to get to agricultural land or to come in with jeeps or anything else. One gate is controlled by that and then completely surrounded. Kalkilia, for instance, is completely surrounded by a wall and a gate. It's the breadbasket of Palestine, and it's been cut off from its land. Okay, I know Chris is going to get mad at me, but I have to say one other thing. Playground by the wall, slated for demolition. So this is Deen. This playground was helped to be built by, I think it's called Playgrounds for Peace. What was that? Playgrounds for Palestine, thank you. And my daughter, who at the time was 4 years old, said, I can't understand why the Israeli government wouldn't be building more playgrounds everywhere. Why would they want to destroy it? Wouldn't that be the thing that would make peace? So think about that. I mean, from a 4-year-old's perspective, and seeing this playground, and it's right next to the wall, is to say, why would you not want this to be the kind of thing that you invest your money in? Okay. U.S. weapons that are used, tear gas and other kinds of weapons. And then I want to say something about Gaza. So I'm just talking from a personal perspective. So I know this summer, one of the things that I saw is that every moment that there were things that were said, either by people in the Jewish community or by people in the Israeli government, or the kinds of things that were going around on Facebook, including the anti-Arab racism, the Islamophobia, but also the way that people could talk about, just mow it down, just get rid of it, once and for all. But the idea or notion of being able to say genocidal things and not act, or the idea that people could be silent at all, was absolutely horrifying. And I know this is the 3rd time Gazans have been under this in terms of the siege. And I remember going to Gaza in 2004, right after like 60 homes had been demolished, and it was devastating to see. There was no way to understand what the rubble meant, and the families that were sitting in canvas tents right by it. There was no way to understand it. And this is me like just getting a little bit of information as a Jewish person, taking a delegation. But then to see the massive amounts of destruction, to talk to Palestinians who are from Gaza and hear every day they're waiting to know whether or not their family is alive, to hear whole families were killed, was overwhelming. And the U.S. role in being absolutely silent and then supportive of Israel in a way that, how is that supporting anybody's security? No way. And I remember my daughter, we were walking in Brattleboro, Vermont, and my daughter, because I teach up there, and my daughter was walking, we were walking along the sidewalk, and I realized that they had put every Palestinian name that had died in the year, the age of the Palestinian. And so we were explaining to my daughter Viola about this, and when she got to the ones that said 5 years old, 4 years old, 1 year old, she stopped and she goes, I don't understand, why are all these babies being killed? And I thought, I have no way to answer her. There's no way, even being an activist on it, I didn't have a way to answer her. And I couldn't do anything that felt enough. And so I feel bad having put Gaza at the last minute. I know we're going to have somebody talking about it. But to imagine, when I think of Jewish history, and I think of being sealed off either in a ghetto or sealed off in a place where you can't escape by land or air or sea, and then being told that you're also horrible people, and also being told that you're horrible people, that this was something that I couldn't, like, how do you, as a Jewish person, there was nothing to do other than to try and organize with people or talk about it, but it really felt overwhelming. So, if anything, again, talking about liberation and justice, is no person on the planet should be living this way. Palestinians have been under occupation for 47 years. The siege has been for at least 8 years. And that doesn't, it says nothing about the malnourishment, the kinds of things you have to do where you can't take care of your family. You can't go to the hospital and get your needs met. You can't go to school on an everyday basis and feel a normal sense of life because there might be a sniper or something else, or a fisherman trying to go. So just to hold that as if it's only us working to liberate Gaza, and that has to be the view at the moment, along with everything happening in the West Bank, let's keep that in mind. How would you feel if you were totally surrounded and unable to get out? And the amazing resistance and resilience of Palestinians, and the international support for boycott, divestment, and sanctions, and how that really is the movement to help pressure Israel and to help pressure the United States, and how that movement is really inspiring. So I know I'm way over, and I am going to stop before I turn to another slide.